What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Book Binge on the King Crusoe YouTube channel. This week is episode 25 of the series, and we're talking about Dune. At this point, it's old enough to be considered a classic, especially within the sci-fi genre, by Frank Herbert, right? Yeah, that's the right Herbert. What is there to say about Dune other than, I'm pretty sure it's still the all-time best-selling sci-fi book of all time. So that, says enough about the book in and of itself. And thanks to the 2021 movie adaptation, the title is also, I think, even more recognizable than ever before because there are now more new, younger audiences who are being exposed to it because of Denny V's work. I first experienced the book in February, and before I picked it up, I actually had no intention to read it within the near future, but then I just kind of jumped on with a quick read along with a pal in Discord and just kind of threw it into the schedule. And I'm honestly really glad that I did. I was debating on making this review actually a Count the Classics video because of the fact that it can kind of sort of be excused as being a classic at this point in time, but I did decide that it falls a little bit too far out of the literary fiction bounds for me to personally feel like it belonged in Count the Classics, so to speak. Maybe I'll kind of broaden the scope of what that series is supposed to be or what kind of stuff it covers over the course of the future, but for now I think this book falls a little bit too far out of the bounds for what kind of stuff I want to cover in that series for sure to really feel comfortable putting it there. And besides, even doing a full scripted review, I don't think I could do this book what most people feel like it really deserves. So instead, I'll just do, kind of the normal review thing with my normal structure and to cover it and just kind of see how that goes. And something that I will actually bring up at the end of this video a little bit more in detail, I did actually watch the 2021 movie adaptation by Denny V before I read the book. So I'm going to talk about near the end of this video kind of some of the feelings that I had with the book as somebody who watched the new movie the new movie in its first half before reading any, especially all of the book. But with all of that being said, let's start with what I think the best elements of Dune are. So bear in mind, I am recording this video. Like I said, I'm pretty sure it's been 4+ months since I actually read the book, but the first thing that pops into my head when I think about the best things of Dune is politics. The house politics is something that I hear about a lot in different fantasy and sci-fi books, stuff like A Song of Ice and Fire, and even like The First Law by Joe Abercrombie. Stuff like that, I always hear people talking about one of the things that makes those books and those series good is the way that the house politics interacts. And that's something that I felt very, very much in this book. Something about the way that Frank Herbert wrote the warring factions and the different houses, and even the way that he mixed and mingled the different viewpoints of people from those different houses, it just kind of all culminated in a way that the characters and the tension made the politics really enjoyable and almost palpable in a really wonderful way. Another thing that I really enjoyed about the book was just the universe, generally speaking. Um, I would say the world building, but the fact is that Herbert goes on to sort of build a first world, but mostly it's focused on one world. But in general, there's a couple more minor locations even than that. So it's really the universe building. Uh, the way that Herbert describes and talks about both Arrakis as the desert planet and Caladan as the world where the Atreides house begins in the story. If I'm being brutally honest, I don't think I've had such potent imagery of what worlds look or even feel like to be in, even since I've read this book. There have been some other pretty good examples with certain parts of The Dark Tower by Stephen King coming close in a way, but just the sheer potency of what I felt really with a specific scene that I can conjure up, even just 4 months later, is when Paul Atreides is sitting in a room on Caladan, and the scenery is being described with the rain coming down on the window, like rain that wasn't expected for the day or something like that, before uh, Duke Leto Atreides walks in, or something like that happens. It's very early on in the book. That scene just felt so, I don't want to say potent again, but it felt really cool. The imagery was just so good. And even to a lesser extent, I can give the same praise to the way that Frank Herbert describes Arrakis, the desert planet. Granted, there's not that much to really imagine with the vast desert, but my point remains. The Sieches, the small bits of the population, especially in the second half of the book, all of it just worked super well. And I suppose to a certain extent, you could probably say that a lot of the reason why I'm able to imagine this stuff so well is because I did watch that 2021 adaptation before I read the book. But even so, the descriptions and stuff are just really good in this book. And now let's talk about something that I think surprised me a little bit, that being the character work. Nearly all of the characters in this book are developed to a really good balance between knowable and mysterious. I know I guess I've heard some people complain or just comment about how they're not a big fan of how certain characters, despite being in their head, you don't really know what's going on with them. I can kind of see where those types of comments are coming from, but I think personally, the way that Herbert balanced the mysteriousness with what we are supposed to know, I guess, for what that character feels, just worked really well. Even with the way that Paul develops in the back half of the book, with certain things kind of escalating in a way that some people I've heard, especially reading in the past few months, not really enjoy that much. I didn't really have a problem with that. There are several points throughout the book where you hear, or rather read, these monologues that exist within characters' heads, and that's something that exists as one of the more memorable parts of the book, really kind of seeing through the character's eyes, but not like, and I guess hearing an intense conversation within their head, but not actually being in their mind, seeing exactly what they see. There's kind of a distinct disconnect there that I think made this kind of balance work for me, at least. Because although you can understand how the characters see the world, you don't really know the characters either. And I guess I just enjoyed this a lot, at least more than I think a few other people did. And finally, I guess I just really loved the overall vibe of Dune, you know? It took me a little bit to really get into in the first book, even though some of the opening scenes of the book are really exciting, when a little bit of that transition is occurring between taking place on Caladan to moving to Arrakis. There's a little bit of slowness, particularly in that first book of the novel, but there was just so much to love about the way that things were built and developed that even if it was a little bit complex, especially with certain naming conventions that just kind of I'm not the biggest fan of in a way, I genuinely think this book was really good for all of the reasons that I just stated. But there are some things that I just don't think worked quite as well either. So, what are the worst elements of Dune? I just mentioned a little bit of the complexity and how, despite it being a bit complex, there was a lot to love about the book. Well, in terms of the complexity, it's probably the first real potential problem that I see with the book. It's really the learning curve of it. It is rather intense if we're just trying to speak honestly. I think my biggest problem was probably like the pronunciations of names and just kind of how out of left field some of them felt, and the way that some of these things are talked about and introduced pretty much immediately. If we're talking a difficulty curve, it spikes up like this, just as soon as it starts. Tons of things to try to understand what's happening, and for me, I think I handled it a lot better than I would have because I actually watched, like I said multiple times before, the 2021 adaptation. Without that movie, I think the beginning of this book would have been way too overwhelming for me, and I just would have found this first, honestly, probably the first like third of the book to be a slog. I probably would have felt that way without the movie. I know that's not how everybody would feel because I know tons of people, obviously, who have read the book because being the highest selling science fiction book of all time for many a year before 2021 means there's millions of people probably who read Dune before that film. But I think depending on how you feel about complex learning curves and things just kind of being complicated from the very start, even though Dune isn't necessarily complicated, it just throws a lot at you all at once. As long as you're okay with that kind of thing, you shouldn't have a problem with this book. But if you're like me, I think the movie does a lot to help with the learning curve. Something else that I didn't necessarily love or hate, but I will put here because I think there's a potential for some people to not enjoy, is the way that Herbert handles viewpoint throughout the novel. This might be the first book that I can actually recall reading where viewpoint just flows from one character to another in the blink of an eye. You can be in the head of Paul Atreides with a monologue from him, and then literally the next paragraph be with his father with a monologue from him. And I'm using monologue rather, comfortably. It's not like monologues occur throughout the entire book, especially internal ones. But one scene, for example, is the dinner scene. I think it's considered the dinner scene that happens. A lot of what makes that scene tick, and part of why I personally agree with it not being in the Denny V's movie, was because there's a lot of flicking from one character's viewpoint and their internal thoughts to another's in the blink of an eye. A lot of what makes that scene work is knowing what all of the characters are thinking about everybody else all at the same time, something that doesn't really translate well to film. It is very jarring to read and just kind of have this viewpoint where you're not really stuck in a character's head. It's part of why I think characters are able to be mysterious and also knowable both at the same time. I think that balance was struck very well, but if you're not aware that the viewpoint does this kind of switching back and forth thing, it can be a little bit weird, or at least it was kind of weird for me. Like I said, some scenes greatly benefit from this, primarily like the dinner scene, because of all the political intrigue and the way that characters are thinking about each other, not just interacting with each other. There's some cool stuff with Viewpoint, but it could be a problem for some people. And then finally, this was something that I actually don't fully know how I feel about. In some ways, I do think that the ending does sort of leave a lot to be desired. Now, it worked perfectly well for me personally, but depending on the reader, there's a lot to really be like, why did you end here? Or, like, why didn't you just continue? Or something like that. Or why didn't you end in a different spot? There's a lot of questions to be asked about why the ending happens the way it does and what could occur afterwards. I can personally see how it kind of feels like empty in a way, kind of like it just needs more to finish off certain arcs. You most particularly with characters, but just in general, hence why Dune Messiah and Children of Dune exist, since most people, at least as far as I've heard, Dune Messiah basically is the end of Dune that Dune didn't have, and then Children of Dune is basically the actual true sequel, or maybe it's that Dune Messiah and Dune Children, or Children of Dune, I guess, together are a sequel to Dune that are kind of necessary to really understand the full arc of like Paul and certain other things. But to me, even though those things might help with answering some of those questions with the ending that leaves a lot to be desired, personally, honestly loved the ending. I could have mentioned this in some of the best elements of Dune, but I did decide to put it in the worst elements because I think there's going to be a lot of people who are like, why? Just wondering why it ended where it did. There's just something about the way that the ending occurred for me that worked because I figured that there was, absolutely no way that Herbert could reasonably wrap things up in this book without doing sequels, like just the way that it occurs and certain things that happen, it's like, yeah, there definitely needs to be a sequel, hence, like I said, Dune Messiah slash Children of Dune. But the thing is, the way that it ended worked for me because it left, at least in my opinion, the perfect opportunity to leave the conclusion to the imagination. There's a lot to be asked about how to finish Paul's arc, especially, but even some other characters' arcs and certain relationship arcs. But for me, at least for now in my life, I think that a lot of those questions, a lot of those things that just didn't get fully tied up, are things that I felt were really good left to the imagination. Like, I like thinking about the ending and being like, well, what happens from here, basically. And like if I do a reread of this book and, at some point in the future, in a decade or two, I might read a couple of the sequels to kind of get some of those, I guess, canon answers. But for me right now, I found it rather satisfying, just this ending, the way that it happens by itself. So that's something that you may really like about the book, something that you may really not like about the book. Just depends on your tastes. And then another issue that I had that I think some other people have mentioned before is just the prose. I know a lot of people who have commented about how brilliant Dune is as a story and conceptually and the things that it does for the genre, but that it was written horribly, that Frank Herbert was not a good writer. I guess I can kind of see some of those arguments. The viewpoint kind of factors into this a little bit, but the actual prose itself is a little bit strange. For me, reading it, there were many times, like once or twice almost every chapter, where certain like sentence structure, certain vocabulary usage, and you could say part of this is because of the age, but I think generally it's just normal vocabulary usage that I just thought was weird. Things that actively took me out of the story and was just like, why did you structure your sentence this way? Certain things like that. Not huge problems, not anything that I would say makes it not worth reading at least once. Things that are like, well, I would never go about writing this book in this specific manner. So it's a very minor issue that I had with the book, but one that I think some people, especially, and I don't want to be, rude by saying prose snobs, but people who are really focused on or who really pay attention to prose may have certain problems with this book. Not a huge issue, but it is worth noting. And like I said at the beginning of this video, like I was going to comment a couple things about having watched the movie before the book and kind of comparing some of those things. There were definitely some really great parts about watching Dune 2021 before reading the book, but there were a couple things that I wonder whether they would have been better or worse had I not seen the movie first, like if I'd read it before going to watch that movie. The first of these things being, like I mentioned earlier, the learning curve was significantly reduced for me because of watching the movie. I don't think I would have DNF'd the book because of this huge, or at least comparatively large learning curve, because I'm somebody who tries not to DNF ever, and if I do, it's only because it's so abysmally bad. It's like I'm just hating myself for reading it. Like it has to be pretty severe for me to want to DNF a book. So I don't think that would have been like the end all be all determining factor of whether I finish Dune, but I found my reading of it, especially in the first half, a lot more enjoyable because I had ideas of what was going on having watched Dune. Not just once, but twice, because watching it the first time, I didn't know anything what was happening. Second time watching it, I actually understood quite a bit. Another thing is that the scenery and visuals of the movie were really, really good. Denis V is so good with just getting perfect shots and just doing things in a way that make his scenes and his directing just pop. Even if some scenes from the book were missing from the movie, just the way that things occurred, I was able to enjoy more because of that. But that's just something that I personally tend to prefer anyway. I'm somebody who likes to watch adaptations. If I intend to watch an adaptation of a book, I like to watch them before I read the book. if I'm interested enough, because it helps me to imagine certain characters or scenes and stuff in that way. I'm a very visual reader. And speaking of missing scenes, since I just mentioned those, I did think that the translation from film to movie, or film to movie, that's from book to film, however you want to put it, was really good. I didn't have any preconceived notions of what I thought the book was supposed to be or what it was going to be as a result of watching the movie beforehand, so that reading the book afterward meant I really understood why certain decisions were made in context of the film and within the book. Like the dinner scene is the greatest notable change between book to movie, but because I watched the movie first and then I read the book, I had a completely different context for being able to understand why it wasn't included, like I said. And of course, obviously, the movie did stop halfway through, so that kind of affected the way that I have to imagine the second half of the book, just because none of it actually happened on film yet. But I am very excited to watch the second part in 2023, just because watching the movie before trying to read the book got me into that first half where things are kind of complicated, and in some ways not a lot happens, in other ways a lot happens. But just being able to get into the world in a visual medium before reading the book made it so that I had a really firm foundation and basis to be able to build that imagination, I guess, of what the second half, what happened in the second half and kind of what it meant to be. Like, there were some issues that I had with watching the movie beforehand because obviously I didn't get to really experience Dune as a book, unimpeded beforehand. But at the same time, there were just so many great things that I got to notice in the book as a result of this that I wouldn't change it. Like, if I could go back and decide whether to read the book before I watched the movie or not, I wouldn't change it. Like, I'm very happy with the way that things happen for me. But overall, it's kind of hard to conclude my overall thoughts on Dune by Frank Herbert. I was surprised to enjoy it as much as I did, though, particularly the ending, like I said leaves a lot to be desired, but I thought, kind of ironically enough, that it worked perfectly for me. There is a lot to be loved and enjoyed here if you can get past things like the prose and certain, like, in my opinion, minor issues like that. I do fully intend to read the book again in the future at some point, maybe in a decade, maybe in 2 decades, who knows, and maybe I'll read sequels then, but I do want to read at least this first book again at some point in the future and see what more I can get out of it, having lived more life by that point. But now we are at the end of this video and this review. Go ahead and check out seasonalproductions.com, my website. If you are so inclined, it has all of my YouTube and personal writing content all in one easy place to access it. I recently redesigned the whole thing, like basically rebuilt it from the ground up in a lot of ways on most pages over April and May, and I'm very happy with how it looks now, whereas I just thought it was serviceable before. So if you're interested in that, I would really appreciate it if you go check it out, but don't forget to like and subscribe and ring the bell so that you know when next week's Book Binge episode comes out, which is about 5 fantasy series that I want to read next year. I'm very excited about that list and really excited to hear what people have to say about some of these books that I'm interested in reading. Over the course of July, I will also be coming out with a bunch of Dark Tower reviews and other videos and stuff like that. Stephen King has been my most popular type of content to cover in terms of actual book reviews, so I hope that you'll also stick around for some of that. So I'll get out of your face now. I've been talking for a bit longer than I thought I would on this book, so I hope you enjoyed the video. Be sure to come back next week. I'll be back again in the next one.